There we go. So welcome back. And today we are going to be covering chapters 5 and 6 in A Religion of One's Own. And so here we go. Let's dive into it. So first of all, I'm just going to make a general comment about um, this chapter that's called Chapter 5 is Pleasure, Desire, and the Deeply Erotic. So I'm just going to start off by saying that in general, as I went through this chapter again and reread it comes to me as a general statement that I love the way that he combines. It's not just a matter of sex and pleasure, so to speak, but he actually ties into flowing and how you don't separate this idea of spirit and sensuality. And I really loved it because I think what happens is that in society that there's such an emphasis on the physical part of sexuality, but and you know that's the drive, that's what everybody talks about, that's what's sold and everything else like that. And it's like it's so much more than that. And that's what I really love about this chapter personally, is that he kind of knocks it off and says, look, that's you're miss if that's all you're focused on, you are missing a huge part of it, and especially the way that it involves the spiritual part as well. And I think that's as a general statement, it's really, really beautiful. And so I'm just going to start off by saying that I love the that's a classic story that he starts off the chapter with, where he's talking about the story of the two monks, where the older monk offers to help the woman trying to get across the river, and then later they have a conversation, and the younger monk is upset and says, "I thought you weren't supposed to have contact with the women." And the elder monk replies, "I put the woman down long ago, but you're still carrying her." I just love that. I love that little bit of a story. Um, as um, he continues on in the chapter, um, he talks a little bit about, in the same section, we're still in the first section, I'm on page 116, down towards the page, the paragraph that starts at, "I live in a Catholic monastery long enough to know many ways that monks slip away from the demands of the eros, and not thinking about it is not a good solution." So in other words, you know, to completely ignore this drive. And I don't just mean, and again, I'm not, when I say that, I'm not just talking about the sexual drive, which is also there, but this idea of just trying to shut down or suppress this flow, or this energy. Um, and then the following paragraph, he goes on to say that many spiritual people are confused about the eros and their sexuality, and they believe in virtue and purity and end up repressing their sexuality. But repressed, it really catches fire, which is, I just think it's funny. So, you know, look, I think everybody has their own decisions, their own way, in terms of the way that they handle their expression and their sensuality and their sexuality. And I just think it's interesting that he who's lived in a monastery and was, you know, going to become a priest, is now saying, yeah, that's not such a great idea. So I just think it's interesting. Um, he goes on in the next section where calls it erotic spirituality. Eros is the spark of the desire and the flame of love. And notice that it doesn't mean the flame of sexuality, but of love and energy moving. Um, in the paragraph below that, he goes on to say that Freud saw it as the principle of life, and Jung as a dynamism of the psyche. in the paragraph below that on page 117, a materialistic culture thinks of sex as physical and biological and can't seem to understand how the soul and the spirit can actually have their own sexuality. And I don't know if that's one of the sections, Joan, that you're mentioning or not mentioning. And if it is,
Yeah, I mean, to me, it sounds like you're talking about two separate things, and
he is. I'm going to go back to what we talked about last week, and unless something changes, my understanding of when he talks about the soul and the spirit, the soul, you can just call it your ego. You can call it your personality, whereas spirit is your spirit. So that's been my understanding of what he is calling the soul and what he is calling the spirit. The soul would be your personality or your ego, and the spirit is your spirit. So
okay.
until he says something differently than that, or one of you has a different insight, I believe that that is what he's referring to based on the comments he's made prior to this.
Okay.
Okay, cool. On page 118, as part of your self-therapy, you could reflect on how you were brought up to think about the eros and recall experiences, good, bad, that still affect you. And just taking a look at that stuff and saying, you know, where are you at? Are you comfortable with it? Are you not comfortable with it? Is it not important to you? Is it important to you? Again, I would just say that there's no right or wrong expression with it. It's just a matter of what you decide is right and wrong for you. That doesn't mean that I don't think out in today's society there aren't problems with it, because I certainly do. Down later in the next paragraph, it starts off, it says, as you envision your own religion now, you can reverse centuries of repressed by boldly blending your spiritual and the erotic. So in other words, he's saying, can you really have both? And for him, in his religion, he's saying you certainly can. What do you say? Can you? Is it okay? Especially when you think about all the stuff that most of us were brought up believing, especially if you were brought up in more of a traditional or fundamental religion. I don't know what your conversations were like, but pretty much, you know, sex was never talked about, and or sensuality was never talked about. And if anything, you know, hush, we don't talk about that. We're not going to talk about it. It's not going to be part of the discussion. And for the most part, mum's the word. I think it's interesting. He goes on in the paragraph on 118 towards the bottom. Once you stop demonizing them and embrace your erotic passions and interests, your entire sense of spiritual may change. So in other words, if you have if it's been something that has been ignored, if it's been something that has been shut down, if it's been something that you've been taught was bad and this, you shouldn't have this, then when all of a sudden you open it up and realize, wait a minute, it's not just about the pure physical part, it could actually be also a part of my spiritual practice, then all of a sudden it's like, wow, that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. I think it's interesting in the paragraph below that he goes, some people seem to think that they're being spiritual by not being sexual. They purchase their spirituality by giving up their sexuality, or at least holding it in low regard. But this makes no sense. So I love the fact that he's just challenging it, and he's making, if anything, you question where you stand. And I think, honestly, just like he's doing with all of religion, but now he's talking specifically in this case about sexuality. You know, he's making you pause for a minute and go, hey, wait a minute, is it really bad? And, you know, should it only be used for procreation? And. So in other words, he's challenging us to look at it ourselves and to see, all right, well, where did these beliefs and ideas come from? And is there something in there that feels good to you in terms of maybe looking at it again or changing your thoughts or your ideas about it? So I think I like that. Let's see, on page 120, I think it's interesting. Again, he's talking more about this, and it's a paragraph that starts off with a clue to the greatest meaning of sex may lie in the sensation you may have after a joyful experience. You may not only feel good because of sex, but you may have an overall sense that life itself is good. Let's see. I think it's great on page 121. The paragraph that starts off with biologically, sex may be about the continuous of the race, but then he goes on to say, but for the soul, sex is more about the mysteries of intimacy and vitality. And that's one of the words that I circled, was vitality. That when we think about that from the standpoint of energy flowing and there being vitality in it. Let's see. I love the he's talking about the eros in the he started in the to continue further down, that it's not just personal, it's one of the main dynamics and powers of life that makes our relationships, our families, and our world. We demonize it sometimes to protect ourselves from its power. Lots of power, lots and lots and lots of power. He goes on to say, this broader view of the eros in its connection with sexuality takes us into the realm of religion. We're talking now about life and meaning. Eros is central to the spiritual life because it's the unimaginably deep and important. It keeps us moving along in life and prevents the small provisional structures we've set up from being too rigid and fixed. Eros is a dynamic force that keeps us awake rather than asleep, alive rather than soul dead. I love him calling it soul dead. I don't know about you, but I've actually met people who, if I was going to define them, I would actually say they feel like they're soul dead to me. There doesn't feel like that. They're like, there's a lot of vitality to them, right? So I love that. I love he uses that word. Oh, let's see. I highlighted this. On page 123, he's talking about, I love that the paragraph starts off with, you think you want a person, you get him, and you aren't satisfied. You think you want to be in a particular place. You get there, and you weren't as happy as you thought you'd be. You think you want more money. You get it, and your hunger is only greater. And so it goes. Desire takes you on and on until you realize that there's nothing in this world that will calm it completely. Then you find deep religion and learn that the ultimate object of desire is God, or the divine, the mysterious and the unamorable. I love that. I love it. So it's saying that, you've got these desires, and you keep getting everything that you want, but then you realize you're still empty until finally your soul realizes the only thing I really want is to be connected again with God, which you already are, but you've just kind of forgotten it. And I'll just share this. In the Buddhist tradition, it's about letting go of desire. Buddha said the biggest cause of our suffering is desire. And so there are people in the Buddhist tradition that believe the goal is to let go of all desire. I, in no way, shape, or form, feel that way at all. I feel like, to me, there's the people, when you break down the word desire of the Father, and so I think it comes right from the divine, is where I think desire comes from. Let me see. I'm going to skip the next pages. And go to page 128 again. Oh, I love this. Okay, so, and you've heard me talk about this sometimes on Sundays when it talks about this idea of the paragraph that starts off with asking the bigger question, what does the soul want now? Allows us to stay alive and awake within the stable relationship, affirming both marital vows and erotic fantasies. So the reason I love that question is that I see people who I feel in life have just quit. They don't think that they think that there's nothing else left for them. In other words, they've gotten to an age where there's no spark left. There's no life left. There's not, like it's not necessarily giving up, but there's nothing else. It doesn't feel like there's anything else that's driving them. It's one of the reasons why they say that within the first year of people retiring, the people that die within the first year of retiring, the percentages are off the charts. And that's because they have no purpose left. And so to me, there's always the next thing, always. If there's not a next thing for you, or anybody, I would seriously be careful. Be careful, because in my mind, and I don't care what the circumstances are, there's always the next thing. What is the next thing? What is the next thing? And so, he just rephrased it and say, what does the soul want now? Because the soul is there's always something. I mean, even if it's just go sit by a tree, even if it's go meditate, even if it's go whatever, there's always the next thing. He goes on page 130, he goes on and talks about the different ways to make your sex lives more spiritual without piling sentimental ideas and holy language on top of them. And so I like when he goes through, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but the different parts that you can include. And I think those are really cool. On page 131, he lists them. And then he talks about, at the bottom of page 131, he starts talking about sex and spirit reconciled. First, you need a philosophy of life that honors your sexuality. Think it through. Arrive at the point when you understand that your sexuality is not just biological, but it is your vitality. Again, he's bringing in the concept or the idea of vitality and source of creative power. It is a positive resource for connecting soul to soul with your partner, in the broadest sense with people. It allows you to be fully in this world, sensing it and feeling it as a part of yourself. Your sexuality makes you sensitive as well as sensuous, and spiritual as well as physical. Beautiful. Beautiful. On page 134, talks about religion versus being religious. And in the paragraph that starts off with, you want your own personal religion to be sex friendly. You want it to be thoughtful, moral, and kind. If you added these three qualities alone to your sexual behavior, free of guilt-making rules about who, when, where, how many, you would start to heal the breach between your religious self and your sexuality. You can be moral without being excessively hard on yourself and others. And when he says that, just understand that doesn't mean that, it means bouncing around from partner to partner and all that kind of crazy stuff. So, anyways, he talks in the paragraph below that, he talks about morality. And he says, morality means acting in ways that are sensitive to the needs of the other and of the world and in our own care. So he defines morality. And I love the paragraph on page 135, the very top of the page, where he goes on to say, developing your own religion is an opportunity to come to peace with your own sexuality. I love that. You can forgive yourself for past mistakes. You can fit your sexual desires in with your other values so they don't dangle and cause problems from your margins. Your sexual behavior can become more instead of, or moral instead of moralistic. And then finally, to wrap it up, he goes on to say under the last section of this chapter, he talks about an erotic lifestyle, and then he's got a list of things that you can do to consider adding. And I think some of these things are really, really great. But to me, it's more about fully living and experiencing all of life. is really what it comes down to. All right, so I think what I'm gonna do, well, now I'm gonna keep going because that way I only have to have one video up there and not the other one. All right. So again, we'll go through the next section and then I'll come back and then you can comment on the different things. And yeah, as you're going through this, I'm sure you're probably thinking that there's a lot of information in here. And it's like, yeah, these chapters are long and he gets long-winded at times. I don't know if anybody else is experiencing that, but I have a tendency to find that with them at times. All right, so now chapter 6, spiritual secularity. Such an interesting opposition. I love the quote from Henry David Thoreau. I find that I conciliate the gods by some sacrament as bathing, or abstemious in diet, or rising early, and directly they smile on me. These are my sacraments. And so as we dive into this chapter, which I really, really liked, on the first page, 139, it says the soul needs regular excursions from reality, and a good religious building can offer you such an excursion. And he just starts talking about actually going inside of a church. And it wasn't that caught my attention. It was the idea that our soul needs regular excursions from reality. You know, like just get away from the ho-hum day-to-day life. I really like, and this is a long section, but I just loved this. So in the middle of page 140, he starts off with a paragraph. It says, in your own religion, you can heal the split between the sacred and the secular, your spiritual vision and your daily life. This doesn't mean that you hold back in either area. You can be as religious as you like or as secular as you like, as long as you keep the two together as a tandem. You can glimpse the sacred in the secular or enjoy worldly life more because of your spiritual vision. So often we've been told that they're to be kept separate. And what he's saying is there's no reason to be kept separate. You can do both. They can overlap each other. In fact, encourages it. Thoreau says that taking a bath is a sacrament. I could say the same about going for a walk, teaching your child, painting your house. These activities seem to be only secular simply because we haven't considered how the holy and the ordinary work together. But if you study and meditate just a little, you may learn to appreciate ordinary activities for their sacredness. And to me, that's it right there, is when you can bring the sacred into the simplest acts of your day-to-day life. It reminds me of the monk that has the practicing the presence of God. It's when you can bring practicing the presence of God into brushing your teeth, into taking the dog for a walk, into whatever it is that you're doing, that's pretty magical to be able to have that experience that seems to be so mundane, and yet it can become so magical and profound. As a child, I memorized a short, elegant definition of sacrament, an outward sign signifying an inward grace. That is, a sacrament is an ordinary thing or activity that, to a properly educated imagination, signifies or points to a deeper spiritual meaning and power. Yeah. Later in that paragraph, he talks about we can take almost any aspect of ordinary life and see its sacramentality, for everything can have an inward grace. I love that. I think that's so beautiful and so profound. In the next page, on page 141, in the paragraph that says, but the sacramentality in the action doesn't appear automatically. And this is a great sentence, I think. If you're unconscious and have no religion of your own, these actions will remain only secular. In other words, it's just an action. You'll never see the divine in brushing your teeth or taking a walk or the things that he's talking about if you don't take that into consideration. I love later in that page, on page 141 down, when he's talking about playing the piano. And as a meditator, I pull open the lid and place my finger on the keys. Bach, Mozart, Chopin are my gurus and my saints. I love that. I love. And now an hour of playing is his puja, his devotion, his practice. So for him, playing the piano is his spiritual practice. That's his meditation, where he goes in. On page 142, well, he talks about the difference between secularism versus secularity. Secularity is a full embrace of the world with all of its allurements, pleasures, and fascinations, as well as the troubles. So in secularity, you don't ignore everything, where secularism is you're void of God, basically. You think that it's got nothing to do with God, nothing. Later in the paragraph, he goes on to say, your challenge then is to create a religion of your own by being secular in a religious way or religious in a secular way. You can learn how to see a secular from the religious angle and vice versa, right? So you can do them both. On the following page, if you want to be fully religious, you must tap into as many of the mysteries around you as possible. And then he goes on to specifically mention the night sky. So now he's going to start rattling off a few different things that he's able to play with. The paragraph, the secular and the spiritual are two sides of a coin. There's no separation between them. If you want to be spiritual, you have to live fully in this world, and vice versa. How many people have ever known somebody that's been no earthly good? They're so spiritual, they're no earthly good, none at all. They're out in the clouds, and to get their feet on the ground is absolutely almost impossible. They just live out in woo-woo land. And I've known a few people that are like that. It's hard. It's very hard for them to live because they're completely disassociated with everything and they're living outside of their body. If you want to be spiritual, you have to live completely in this world of the senses and your ego. You can't be an earthly, sensual, fun-loving person if you don't make peace with the deeper spiritual questions of your humankind. Not only do you have a spiritual practice, that spirit has direct impact on all aspects of your life. It's implicated, woven throughout, an important part of who and what you are. I love the comment that he makes in the paragraph that says, as you go deeper into everyday life, further down in that paragraph, he says, most traditionally religious people start at the wrong end. I think this is a brilliant point. They begin by addressing the afterlife and miss out on the sacred and the eternal right in front of them. They fail to understand that to have a meaningful idea about the afterlife, you must first appreciate the internal aspects of this life. I just think that's brilliant because that is so accurately true, especially in traditional religions, where they're sitting there telling you all these things that are or are not going to happen to you after you die. And therefore, you should live your life accordingly because of what's going to happen after you die. And so all this focus is on afterlife. And it's like, yeah, but what about this life? Right? And I just think it's funny that, in my opinion, the truth is nobody knows what's going to happen after we leave here. And yet they're, oh no, this is the way that it's going to be. This is the way it's going to be. All right. I think Sharon, we lost connection with Sharon.
Uh-oh.
What's that?
Are you there?
She's not on the call anymore. She's not here. So she must have dropped. We can wait a minute if you would like. Well, I don't know if it was a computer thing or I don't know. I don't know. All right. So I'm going to continue on then. On page 145, he says, once you grasp the sacred and the secular, you can, if you wish, go back to the traditional religion with an entirely different point of view, which is the entire point of this book. Then you'll see how the traditional teachings and rituals lead you into the mystical and sacred dimensions of your life. They will have more meaning, not less, although their meaning will have changed because of your maturing spirituality. And I love the comment about your maturing spirituality. So in other words, it's a process. And to that point, under in the section, the alchemy of spirit, he goes on to say that in the paragraph that starts with, we've already seen the becoming of a soulful person, he goes on to say, people often think of spirituality as fixed and settled once and for all. But the spiritual life too is light and dark, happy and sad. It requires a special kind of work that bridges the external and the internal life. It consists of stages of maturing. And I think the more I understand my own journey and study more, the more that I can say that without a doubt that it's about growing into your own spiritual maturity. In fact, I've done a talk called Spiritual Maturity. So there's stages of it. There's stages of growth. I think this is an interesting little poem that he reads by Wilkie, I think is a person's name. God's gods, you used to come all the time, and now you sleep in the things around us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then further down in the paragraph that starts off like so many good poets, he goes on to say at the bottom of that, he says, we don't feel their presence. And so we live in an inanimate world, a world without gods and therefore without a soul.
All right. So me, there, the soul seems to not be ego. It seems like it should be spiritual.
Well, I think in that context, I think it all comes down to context, Joan. In that case,
Yeah.
I think he is talking about a world without soul. So I see that completely different than what he's talking about and using that earlier. That's what it feels like to me.
He bounces around with his definition of soul then.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit, because in the first, in the beginning of it, its soul is definitely ego and everything, but there it's not. Yeah, I would agree with that.
That's
I would totally agree
confusing
with
me.
that. Yeah, I totally get that. I would agree with you. Totally. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna flip forward quite a bit to page 153. And he's talking about this idea of resurrection. And in his mind, he starts talking about it a little bit before that at the bottom of page 152, where he talks about this idea of resurrection, which sees symbol and metaphor as the means of detecting the sacred and the secular. But then he goes on to talk about this idea at the top of the page 153 that true nature of life is resurrection. All life is life after death, a second life, a reincarnation. The core teachings of Jesus focus on this kind of resurrection, the revelation of a hidden, rich possibility in human life. They are mainly about taking life to a new level, making a crucial shift from plain, unconscious living to an awareness of the depth and the vast reach of things, especially living from love rather than all unresolved bitterness. Yeah, I just like I like that idea. I like the concept of it. I love the again, as he continues to talk about resurrection in the bottom of the page 153, the theology of resurrection that we find in several religious traditions is about your resurrection now in this life. And then again, he asks the question, will you remain soul dead? Will you remain soul dead? Or will you wake up with a spiritual imagination and appreciation for the sublime? On page 154, how do you resurrect in your everyday life? You learn to see through the literal all around you to the great mysteries at work. The great mysteries at work. All right. I'm going to stop the recording.